Hello, we're your hosts, Sourish
and Kuan,
this is WaffleByte,
where we bring you interesting bites about technology,
business,
and things that might change the world.
You can find all our sources in the description,
and you can skip to the chapters you're most interested in.
But for now, enjoy the show. Hello, welcome to episode 11 of WaffleByte. So this week, on Wednesday, I did a treasure hunt around London. And the idea was that we would be given texts over the course of, I think it was about 3 hours. And the text would kind of contain directions or subtle hints as to where we're meant to go. And every now and then, we'd end up having to enter a pub. And I don't know why they like pubs. But we entered the pub. Then we'd have to say some sort of secret message to the bartender. And they'd give us an object that we kind of have to manipulate with and play with to get our next clue. And we just went on this cycle for a couple of hours. And it was really interesting, quite an interesting idea.
Did you drink anything at the pub, though?
It's a very random question, Kuankuan, but no, I didn't.
Well, I perhaps would suggest that maybe you should try something next time. But today I had an awful day, actually, because I managed to cut myself really quite badly on my peeler. And it was quite a deep cut, and I've already bled through a plaster, and now you can see how it's all red. So
aren't peelers designed to be safe?
They are, until you press your finger onto the blade. But anyways, how's your illness, Sourish? Are you getting better?
I'm pretty much fully recovered now. I'll cough every now and then, but otherwise I'm okay. And the thought for this week is Asus stopped making their Zenfone small. Apple stopped producing a mini variant of their flagships. Samsung never made a successor to the S10e. Why did small flagships all die? For our first topic, I want to give you some thoughts about my new laptop. I've owned my HP Spectre X360 for 10 weeks after having had a Microsoft Surface Pro 7 for 4 years, just like yourself, Kuankuan. And my HP Spec has 16GB of RAM and the Intel Core Ultra 7 155H.
And would you believe that it's already last gen?
It is, and we'll get onto that a bit later. First off, the build quality. So a key reason I chose this laptop over, say, an Asus ZenBook was because of the premium build quality of the HP, and I'm super impressed with it all around. I'm not usually a fan of branding, and the HP chassis actually has a very limited amount of branding. But the branding it does have is HP's relatively new logo, which is just 4 lines, which is nice and minimalist, so I'm a huge fan of that. Now, one thing that most laptops do quite bad is that they have a load of stickers on your palm rest and they place them in really random directions. And HP did a decent job here. However, the Intel sticker on my laptop was not horizontal. So even though the sticker itself was actually quite a nice black with a bit of silver, the sticker was just not horizontal, and I don't understand why the sticker guy cannot fix that. Now, regarding the lid and the screen of the laptop, it's actually really nice and sturdy, which is not something we tend to see in laptops, especially Ultrabooks. But I assume this is probably because this is a 2-in-1, and so you just need a stiffer lid if you were to, for example, fold it over and write on it. Now, the only real issue that I have with the build of this laptop is how incredibly difficult it is to open. Now, it's hard to convey this just over like a podcast, and I probably sound like a clown, but if you ever go hands-on with this device in like a John Lewis or something, you'll instantly see what I mean. It's impossible to open.
Having been hands-on with it, as you mentioned, at a John Lewis, I do see what you mean, but I do see why that design choice was made, because with a 2-in-1, you really, really don't want your hinge to be floppy. But I think they could have made a cutout which would allow you to at least grip the top half of the laptop better.
Yes, and that's something that the ZenBooks have. So here, HP chose form over function, and it's kind of the one place where they shouldn't have chosen form over function, because I actually get blisters over a long enough period if I keep opening and using this laptop on a daily basis, and it's so annoying. But overall, the design of the whole device is phenomenal, and it's so good. Now, onto the battery life. So, as of very recently, as you mentioned, Kuankuan, my Intel chip has been demoted to a last-gen chip. However, the battery life that I'm getting is actually quite good. And standby, for example, overnight or during the day is excellent. It's usually about -1% per hour, or even less if the laptop actually shuts itself down overnight, which Windows does like doing. Battery life over the day whilst I'm using it is also pretty good, but I have noticed it's hugely dependent on what I'm doing. Like, I could get maybe 3 or 4 hours of screen on time, or I could get over 10 hours of screen on time. It just really depends what I'm doing. The charging speeds are also pretty good, because whilst most laptops do charge at 65 watts, like the HP maintains 65 watts from pretty much 0% to 100%. And that is very, very, very uncommon. And I think that's something that's a bit underrated in devices just overall, in phones and laptops. But overall, the battery life is actually really good. And so whilst the latest AMD and Intel chips are obviously like way better, I think the battery on laptops using Qualcomm's latest chips isn't actually significantly better than my laptop, for example, which is actually super, super surprising for me. I'll keep the screen section short because it's a Quad HD display with 120Hz and it's OLED, and it is absolutely astounding. Very little to say here, other than perhaps maybe more uniform bezels and smaller bezels would have been nice. In terms of the keyboard, it types very well, but as you pointed out, Kuankuan, the font on the keys is certainly an interesting choice. You do get used to the font pretty quickly, but yeah, the letters, they're really big and frankly childish for what is touted as a professional laptop. Now, the real issue with the keyboard is the layout of the keys. It's infuriating. So I'll try keeping my rant here as short as I can. But basically, HP added some random keys, like one to launch HP's gaming software on an Ultrabook. And then they also had another key to open the projector panel, despite there being a very simple keyboard shortcut that does the exact same thing.
This is actually something I can relate with because the Dell engineers, in their infinite wisdom, decided to put the power button on the top right-hand corner of the keyboard. And so when you try to press delete, you end up pressing the power button. And in fact, that's something a lady who was trying to help me with a SolidWorks bug did during my SolidWorks session. And it was quite unfortunate because she just slammed the power button as opposed to the delete button. So I think keyboard engineers really need to just not change the simple layout that everybody likes, it's universal, and instead just either put keys elsewhere or just remove junk keys like you've been saying.
I don't get it. Like, don't these people use the same keyboards we do? Like, surely they know what a keyboard's meant to be like. And no one, apart from these HP clowns, put a backslash key on the right of a keyboard. And that's extremely off-putting, especially if you're programming and you want to do \n. That's just, I just always miss the shortcut or the key to do that. The enter key is one row tall. As you mentioned, the delete key on my laptop is also not in the top right because that's where the power button is. The octothorpe key is also just above the enter key, which is super confusing because that's a key you use all the time, at least if you're a programmer. And worst of all, and this actually infuriates me on like a minute by minute basis, but the home, end, page up, and page down buttons are all integrated onto the arrow buttons. So that requires pressing the function key to use those 4 buttons. And I mean, I guess fine, that would be manageable if the function plus shift key combination wasn't mapped to turn on permanently the function key. So this means that you can't really like select text whilst also simultaneously pressing home. And that is just infuriating because anyone who like actually cares about typing fast and navigating and selecting text whilst typing, they will use this key combination all the time. And the fact that it's extremely difficult to use on this device is just so annoying. It works against the user, and HP market this as a premium device for professionals, yet they don't seem to cater to them in the keyboard layout. On a more positive note, the trackpad is actually really nice. It's a haptic trackpad, but crucially, it also physically moves, quite like Apple's brand new innovative camera control button. So the trackpad is excellent, no complaints there. Now the stylus, it's really good, and it has this quite nifty light for battery status. But the battery doesn't last very long. The benefit, I guess, is that it does charge up in like minutes, but as the battery is non-replaceable, that just means it's going to degrade very quickly and go through a ton of battery cycles over time, and probably render the stylus pretty useless in 1 year's time.
I feel that's the same with a lot of different styluses though, because my Apple Pencil also essentially has a non-replaceable battery, And for me, it's been fine, despite the fact that it's been used for years.
I suspect, though, your Apple Pencil lasts more than a week on one charge. Am I right?
That would be false, actually, because it's designed so that you always magnetically connect it to the
Oh, yeah,
iPad.
yeah.
So I've been in situations where I've had an intense session of writing with my Apple Pencil, and the battery's at 60%. But of course, it doesn't matter because I can magnetically connect it back to the iPad and it just charges.
Yeah, HP should have done that because I have to physically plug in a cable, and my pen is pretty much on 24/7 just by nature of how the pen works. There's no battery saving feature enabled from what I can see. Now, we have to talk about Windows because this is, of course, a Windows laptop after all. And at least when I bought it, it was a state-of-the-art 14-inch Ultrabook, and you'd expect it to be pretty fast, right? It has some super fast RAM, it has Intel's, at that point, latest Meteor Lake processors, and yet, to me, I feel like it still struggles a fair amount with pretty basic tasks, like just switching between a couple tabs and a couple windows just here and there, nothing even strenuous. Now, I can only assume that because the hardware is so good, this is an issue with Windows itself. Now, it could be HP's extra bloat that I didn't delete just because it has just enough utility to keep, but I feel like it probably is Windows in this case. I think Windows just really holds back the hardware, and whilst HP has done a great job with the hardware and probably the firmware too on this £1,700 MSRP machine, Windows almost makes it feel like I'm using a £500 device, which is sad. There's nothing I can do there, so oh well. But this does raise the question of how much should we chase specs when we're purchasing a computer or even a phone? Like, obviously specs help to, for example, render your SolidWorks model faster, but specs do not really tell you anything about how fast a device feels to use.
I think the thing is that you don't really understand how much faster your computer can be because people don't really have a point of comparison. So when they upgrade a laptop, it always feels much faster to them because the previous laptop should be slower and older. They don't really have a really high-end computer to compare to. So I don't think most people would care. Having said that, as somebody who is currently very frustrated with their computer, I certainly do think that I would love a laptop that has a faster processor, not only to do things like SolidWorks, but also just to make the whole system feel faster.
On the whole, this is a fantastic device, and I'm really, really happy with the purchase. Now, for the next topic, we're going to talk about Google. Google has been fined 2 undecillion rubles by the Russian government. And there's no point even converting this to dollars for you, because that's a 2 followed by 36 zeros. It's too big of a number for our human brains to comprehend. This is, in fact, so high that it's higher than there even is money on this planet. And the reason that the fine got so high is because with every week that passes, the Russian government said that this fine is going to double. And as Google has been ignoring this fine for years now, it of course has compounded to a unimaginably large number.
It's just a stupid situation. Like, nobody cares about this. Like, the Russian government know they're not going to get paid. Google's not going to pay them. It's just a pointless situation, really.
Indeed. In fact, did you know that a Kremlin spokesman admitted that he, and I quote, "I cannot even pronounce this number," which I found very amusing. Now, also whilst looking into this story, I learned that Google, just like the market cap of Google, is equivalent to 2% of the world's GDP. Isn't that nuts? Like, a 50th of the entire world is Google.
I agree, but also these calculations, they're always done in a bit of a wishy-washy way, because GDP and a market cap is not something you can necessarily directly compare. But obviously Google is hugely valuable at around 2 trillion, I believe. And it is just unbelievable how some companies are so big.
Now, the reason behind this fine was that the Kremlin wasn't very happy that Google banned their state media on YouTube, and Google just refused to comply. Of course, Google also refuses to pay the Kremlin this sum of money, or I guess any sum for that matter. They've just kind of withdrawn from Russia. Clearly, people aren't taking this fine too seriously, because Google stock still increased. Now, that was kind of off the back of good quarterly earnings reports, but it also kind of says that no one really cares about this fine. No one really cares about the Russian market from a Western big tech perspective. So, what is the point of this fine?
For me, I think that firstly, given the fact that Russia has isolated itself from Western companies and Western culture even since the invasion of Ukraine, I think that Western companies simply don't really care about doing business in Russia anymore. It's sort of they've either cut losses if they had previously done business in Russia, and in the future there's no expectation that business will resume. So for Western companies, they essentially don't care. But I think from the Russians' perspective, this is perhaps a good propaganda point for the Russian government, which, as we know, is heavily dominant in terms of the propaganda that they spread. So maybe that's the reason why this fine is still a thing.
But couldn't the news of this fine spread around within Russia? And couldn't that negatively affect the PR of the government? Because it just makes the Russian government look immature. The fact that they're giving Google like a fine too large for them to pay, doesn't that just make them look like a baby?
Maybe. You would have to ask a Russian to really get the answer to that. But I suspect that government propaganda departments tend to be very good at spinning literally any story positively for the government. So maybe you're undermining the Russian propaganda department's ability a bit there.
That is true. And one final question. As we've seen with this fine, it's really big, and so Google just withdrew from Russia. But does this kind of show to us that the Western governments, do they have to keep the fines that they give to big tech quite small? Because if they make the fines too big, then there's a risk that, for example, Google might just leave a certain market or a certain industry or a certain sector. And is that the reason that the fines that Google, for example, are receiving is really small and usually just in the millions, which is nothing for them?
I think, as always, a balance needs to be struck because currently we see people fining Google, Apple, and as you said, they're quite small. They're like a slap on the wrist. So you're not really doing anything by fining them, 2 million, 3 million, because that doesn't mean very much to a $2 trillion company. But at the same time, obviously fining a company trillions and undecillions, that's not helping either. So as with lots of things, a balance needs to be struck. Now, what was interesting was that Apple was required to pay 14 billion in taxes to Ireland, but as part of their business in the European Union. And even then, I don't think they cared that much. If I'm being honest, I don't think there was a huge reaction to that. Now, obviously, it was in the pipeline, so it wasn't totally a surprise. But still, given Apple's cash balance, they could afford to pay 14 billion just fine. So I do see your point there, because we're not seeing any fines that are actually causing issues for companies. So it is tricky.
On a random note, I recently saw that Warren Buffett has currently over $300 billion in cash, which I just found intriguing, especially comparing this to big tech.
Well, as Warren Buffett would say, cash is not trash. And I do agree with that sentiment, especially because actually, historically, in the past couple of years, your cash is still earning you 5% interest, so it's not doing nothing. And whilst the stock market, the S&P 500, is doing quite a bit better than that. It's not trash. It's not trash.
And for the next segment, we'll talk about Nothing. Nothing has announced their community edition of the Nothing Phone 2A Plus, and there are 1,000 units of these available for purchase at the same price as the original device. Now, Nothing worked with the community over the past few months to create this device, and they held a competition on their forum, and there were 4 stages to this competition. And the winners of each stage were taken forward, and they obviously won, and Nothing's teams worked with these winners to create the final product of this phone. So the 4 stages were: 1, phone design, so how the phone actually looks; 2, wallpaper, so what wallpapers are shipped with the device; 3, packaging, how the phone is packaged and what the box looks like; and finally, marketing. What is their main slogan going to be? How are they going to sell these devices? Now, the phone itself is very similar to the 2A Plus, except that the metal strips on the 2A Plus are replaced with this greenish glow-in-the-dark hue, which I think is quite nifty.
I personally am once again not very into the Nothing design language, but I do think that what they've done is quite cool. It's certainly nothing I've seen before, so credit where credit's due. I think that's quite cool, but it's not something for me, and I would obviously not buy this.
The glow-in-the-dark, I was actually quite hesitant that this would work, or skeptical that this would work, but based on the unboxing videos that I've seen, it seems as if the glow-in-the-dark green is actually relatively strong and that it can hold light for a good amount of time, which is certainly interesting. Now the wallpapers, they all have this sort of pipe theme to kind of symbolize connection and the fact that Nothing has this connection with the community and that maybe you can go down one path or one pipe and end up somewhere else and something like that, which is certainly a unique take to wallpapers. Now the packaging was quite standard actually compared to the 2A Plus, but I didn't realize how big of an industry packaging is. Like, how do I place a product in a box and how do I design the exterior of a box? That is actually a huge industry, which I didn't realize until a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, just to add to that, a couple of years ago, you may remember Apple infamously decided to remove their charging brick from the box of the iPhone, and therefore the box was much slimmer and they were able to ship a lot more per container. And so that no doubt saved them a lot of money. They would tell you they're actually saving the environment, but nonetheless, I think they saved a lot of money. And similarly, if you design packaging well, not only do you make sure your product gets to where it needs to be safely in one piece, you also can save a lot of shipping costs, as Apple probably found out.
Finally, for marketing, they latched onto this idea of a firefly, as if you need to kind of find your life and blah, 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 blah. And actually, let me give you a quote that they said on their website regarding this. Like fireflies, the glowing feature can also be functional. Fine. Allowing you to locate your phone in the dark. Sure. Or indicate your presence. Like, what are you indicating your presence for in the dark? Why are you in pitch black with your Nothing Phone 2A Plus Community Edition? And you're flexing that you can indicate your presence using the back of your phone.
Well, I don't know. Maybe in certain social settings, when it's dark, it may be cool. I simply don't understand this at all, because phones actually can emit light in the dark.
Indeed.
As anybody who's used a phone ever would tell you. So I certainly don't get this. But I guess...
It also has a glyph interface.
Yes, I guess for the community members who like it, it's cool. But as I've said, I'm certainly not one of those people.
The company Nothing is very much community grown. They have a strong community and they involve the community throughout the process, not just for this product, but also for all of their products so far. And it's almost like OnePlus back in the day, like 10 years ago. But the question I have is, will Nothing ever hit mainstream enough to become like OnePlus are today? Because I don't recall OnePlus being this much into design, uniqueness, or the community. Because OnePlus mainly focused on bringing really, really, really good specs at a really, really low cost. And also, because Nothing is based in Britain, whereas OnePlus was focused in China, I think Nothing find it easier to connect with their Western community more, who are more likely to buy these products in the first place.
I would actually disagree when you characterized OnePlus as mainstream. I think maybe they were a couple of years ago, but these days you can argue that anything that isn't an iPhone is not really mainstream per se. Obviously, Samsung and the Pixel devices in the Western market have a considerable market share, but I would suggest that the iPhone is certainly the mainstream. And previously with OnePlus, what they did was they offered a much better value proposition back in the day, where not only were phone prices getting higher and higher, but you sort of weren't seeing as much innovation. But crucially, people weren't locked into ecosystems as much back then. So these days, with the iPhone getting, frankly, cheaper and cheaper, and the fact that everyone and their grandmother has an iPhone, so everybody's locked into the ecosystem, iPhone has become the default. It's become the mainstream. And even somebody like Samsung really struggles to gain market share amongst the Western population. So I really do think that Nothing is a niche player of niche players. So obviously, I don't think they'll ever become mainstream. But also, I think that their selling point is in some ways much weaker and much narrower in terms of its appeal than what OnePlus managed to do.
Yes, everyone cares about value, but not everyone cares about design. And Nothing almost portray themselves as this design studio making some technology, and not really the other way around.
I think for me, what Nothing could do that would give them credibility is if they collaborated with one of those luxury designer fashion brands and really lead into sort of their design element. Now, I don't think that's ever going to work from a business standpoint because of the stakeholders involved and the fact that you're not really promoting a £400 phone to a luxury audience. They're simply not going to care. They're going to keep using their latest iPhones. But still, I think it would be an interesting exercise for them to try something similar along those lines.
Honestly, I really want to buy this phone just to check it out. But unfortunately, I've spent my annual budget on tech gimmicks already, haven't I, Kuankuan?
I think you have, and I think it would be very wise to not buy this. In fact, even if you did want to buy this, you probably wouldn't get it because it's limited edition.
Yes, there are waiting lists, and I'd have to act really, really fast. Now, looking at the YouTube comments of the videos that unboxed this phone, all of the commenters just seem to love Nothing. I'm not going to say it's a cult, but it's certainly a very strong and like a religious following to Nothing, which I find interesting because if you have this really small but passionate fan base, they are very monetizable. And so does Nothing really need to grow that much? Do they really intend to grow, as you said, to become truly mainstream? Is that their target? Because they may publicly say that's their target, but does Carl Pei genuinely think he can achieve that? Or is he just going to constantly focus on the niche of niches to really build up this passionate community? Finally, we'll talk about the Apple event. This week, Apple had 3 separate days of Mac announcements, and on each day, they released a short YouTube video describing what they just released. Now, this was very unusual from Apple, very interesting. But actually, not too many things were announced. I think on the first day, it was iMac. On the second day, it was the Mac Mini. And on the third day, it was the MacBook Pros.
There were a couple of notable things that I gathered over these 3 days. Now, firstly, I think their marketing strategy, was actually quite good because every day I would come back and at some point I would check my YouTube feed and there was a pile of stuff about some new Mac. And so they really succeeded in getting quite a bit of the media cycle to cover their stuff. In terms of what they actually released, I think that they did something that I thought they would never do, but they made 16 gigabytes the base for every single Mac ever. And I think that has a couple of implications. Firstly, it's clearly long overdue, given how cheap RAM is these days. But also, there are now a couple of devices which represent really, really good value propositions. One of them being the Mac Mini, which I really want actually. It's £500 with an education discount, same in dollars, I believe. And that's just incredibly cheap for the compute you get. Because although the M4 is not new, we saw it in fact in the iPad, it's still incredibly capable as a processor. And if I didn't have to do things like SolidWorks, I would be certainly buying one immediately. But also, they released M4 Pro and M4 Max chips. And those chips seem to be incredibly capable compared to the M3, chiefly because they have more cores. And I think that's perhaps Apple realizing that they need to make their improvements a bit bigger because so many people had bought the first gen Apple MacBook Pros and not upgraded, whilst also the competitors such as AMD, Intel, and maybe to a lesser extent Qualcomm, they've really stepped up their game. So I wonder if Apple is feeling pressured.
As the competition ramps up and Apple's lead by using ARM in laptops has gone, they're really feeling the need to innovate more and work at a faster pace. And so that's what we saw this week with way better value propositions on their Macs. And we hope that this continues and that we have all of these companies fighting over laptop market share that will ultimately just get us some insane laptops in the next few years.
Very shortly, Americans will be visiting the polls to cast their ballots, if they haven't done so already, to vote for the 47th President of the United States. Whilst we will refrain from taking a position, it is abundantly clear that one of the biggest issues in this election is immigration.
So that's why immigration is such a
but immigration and border control
confirms that more than 13,000 illegal immigrants
immigration system. I've been clear.
Demonize immigrants, saying they are poison in the blood of our country.
Anybody who has some knowledge of American history will know that basically everyone, bar Native Americans, are the descendants of immigrants. What is less known, however, is the difference between the many waves of immigrants and how differently they were treated. Initially, settlers in what is now known the US are, perhaps unsurprisingly, all of European origin. Indeed, whilst there were some minor settlements by Spanish and French settlers, by the census of 1790, the majority of the population in the United States were of British origin. Most came from England, but a significant portion came from the rest of the British Isles. Elsewise, there was little immigration during this period from 1790 to the early 1800s. However, it should be noted that the slave trade occurred throughout this period of time, and whilst they weren't counted as immigrants at the time, they would eventually be recognized as American citizens. Currently, African Americans form the third largest ethnic group at around 12% of the American population, mostly in the south of America. The latter part of the 19th century and the early 20th century represented a huge wave of migration into the United States. Around 5 million German migrants, 3.5 million British, and 4.5 million Irish migrants entered the US, with millions more from other countries.
At Ellis Island, America's primary immigration gateway for over 60 years. From 1892 to 1954, over 12 million immigrants walked through those doors and were processed as they entered America.
These European migrants predominantly came from Europe to the East Coast, given the main method of transportation remained by ship. These migrants would contribute towards local culture, and the famous Italian-American culture in New York is a product of this era's immigration.
In the New World, they made their mark, in art and fashion, in music and film, weaving an essential thread into the American tapestry, perhaps nowhere more so than in the realm of food. Pizza, spaghetti and meatballs, baked ziti, chicken parm. Over 15.7 million people in the US identify as Italian Americans, and an even larger number regard Italian food as their comfort food.
Simultaneously, a significant portion of Asian immigrants came to Hawaii and the West Coast. Many came from China, which was at the time suffering from a series of issues inflicted by the Opium Wars. These immigrants, who were severely discriminated against, often worked hard manual labour jobs and were first recruited to work on the railway. They were treated harshly by their employers and the local population, with one senator describing them as automatic engines of flesh and blood. This was before the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. This was passed in 1882 and, as the name suggests, effective at excluding Chinese migrants. Soon after, though, migrants from Japan and the Philippines began to replace the Chinese migrants in some low-skilled jobs. This act was not fully repealed until the 1965 Immigration Act, signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Ambassador Goldberg, distinguished members of the leadership of the Congress, distinguished governors and mayors, my fellow countrymen. We have called the Congress here this afternoon not only to mark a very historic occasion, but to settle a very old issue that is in dispute.
This essentially got rid of the previous immigration formula, which focused on preserving America's then ethnic composition by encouraging immigration from Northern Europeans and discriminating against Southern Europeans and Asians. The current immigration system was broadly more generous, allowing many European migrants to join their families. It also kickstarted a new wave of immigration from Asian countries like China, who previously had very low quotas of number of people that the US would let in. These measures have caused a demographic shift in the American population. And this brings us nicely to the current issue facing the American immigration system. For the past few years, there has been an influx of illegal border crossings into the US. This is because people from countries affected by war, corruption, and natural disasters wish to seek asylum in the US. Asylum is a process where somebody fleeing from their country due to unsafe conditions, be it war or political violence, is given protection in another state and allowed to work there. Crucially, in order to seek asylum in the US, you must be in the United States itself.
I don't really understand this last clause that you just said. Like, why does this exist? You're encouraging people to go onto US soil just to get mad at the issue of migration. Like, that's just stupid. I don't understand why this exists.
That is absolutely a valid point you raised. And actually, there are some measures that American lawmakers have tried to make this process a bit more sensible. For example, they've released an app where you can book an appointment to seek asylum. So effectively, you would only then cross the border illegally if you got an appointment. Now, the problem with this system is that essentially supply and demand is imbalanced. So there's a huge demand for these appointments because many people want to enter America to seek asylum, but there aren't enough appointments available on the app. So what people have done up to this summer really was just to cross anyways, because once you cross the border, you would essentially be released and you would be able to work after a couple of months. The current issue is not everybody crossing the border is actually eligible for asylum, and border officials, as we previously described, are under-resourced and for the longest while were instructed to let anyone crossing the border in. Recently, however, this has somewhat changed with stricter rules on who can be let in at the border. Frankly, it just baffles me why this wasn't implemented in the previous couple of years, where illegal immigration numbers have skyrocketed. This has contributed towards the fact that there are nearly 12 million undocumented immigrants currently living in the US. Now, we will point out that one of the political candidates running in this election has suggested that there are actually much more undocumented immigrants, but I do not see any evidence suggesting so we're running with 12 for now. Now, this has caused a number of issues, including worker exploitation, where because of the fact that these migrants are undocumented, they can be paid below minimum wage, subject to harsh labour conditions, and they also don't pay tax. It also leads to overcrowding in certain areas, and Republicans have essentially shipped off immigrants to the democratic cities because of the disagreement in border policy. And also there has been racism instigated by local people, not only to migrant communities, but also to local minority communities who are already existing residents. The rhetoric in this election cycle, though, has further sowed division in communities, reaching a peak during the presidential election where former President Trump claimed Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, were eating cats and dogs.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country.
Widely reported to be false after the fact, it shined a light on the divisiveness of this issue and the real issues people are facing in certain areas due to an influx of immigrants.
I don't want to get into politics, but I think the biggest issue we're seeing with this election is the divisive nature, where lots of people who support one party think that the world's going to end if the other party gets elected, and so on. And in fact, Quan, you may have seen Zach from Jerry Rig Everything released a video, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, where he essentially communicated the same narrative, which is that if one candidate is picked over the other one, then America will be a completely different place and the world will change after a few years. And I think that's just a bit too extreme. I think we're seeing people being pushed to the extremes and not realizing that a government is formed of thousands of people. And whilst the very, very top in power are elected and the people we choose, there are still so many other people and so many other checks and balances that will mean that we're not going to enter a completely radically different world if we choose a different candidate versus this candidate. The thought from the beginning of the episode was, Asus stopped making their Zen phones small, Apple stopped producing a mini variant of their flagships, and Samsung never made a successor to the S10e. Why did small flagships all die? Flagship phones with the latest technology and best specs, but in a compact form factor of 6 inches or less, they all used to be a thing. But now they're not. Why?
Because they don't make money. And it's simple as that. Apple's iPhone mini series sold not very many units, as I'm sure we'll get to. And I suspect that it's similar with the Zenfone lineup. So the reality is, no one wants a small phone. It may be that people who want small phones are loud, but there aren't very many of them.
Yeah, so the regular iPhone 13 peaked at about 10.4% in terms of worldwide adoption rates, and that was about a year ago. However, the iPhone 13 mini, which was the last mini to exist from Apple, that peaked at 1.4%, so almost 10 times fewer sales than the regular 13. Now, even though this is a very small percentage of the total sales from the iPhone 13 series, surely this still does make money for Apple. Like, they're still selling a lot of this product, and they're almost certainly still making a profit on it.
I think it's an opportunity cost, right? If I can sell you a 13 mini, I might make $100. That's brilliant. But if instead I sell you a 13 Plus, or I guess that wasn't a thing back then, but if I sell you a 13 Pro, I'm making $150, say. Now that's better, right? And you're not going to buy a 13 mini and a 13 Pro. So you'd rather sell them the expensive stuff. And I think that's what Apple has realized, that not only do people not really want the mini, they are essentially having an opportunity cost by offering this, because they could just offer a bigger phone and they would make more money that way.
Now, when it comes to Samsung, back in the S10 series, they also released an S10e. And this was actually a phone that I was very, very, very close to buying. And the reason I didn't was because I could only get my hands on the Exynos variant. But otherwise, I would have bought this phone. And the S10e, it made up 22% of the S10 series of sales, which is actually pretty good. That's like a fifth of their sales. So why did Samsung cancel it? And this was before Apple cancelled their mini variants. So I'm really confused about why Samsung cancelled the flagship E series. Maybe a potential reason is that the S10e faced a fair amount of battery and thermal issues, in the sense that it would get really hot in your hand, and the battery wouldn't last very long. But that was also in part due to the fact that it was an Exynos chip in most of the West.
I think smartphone manufacturers really want a certain experience for their users. So I wonder if they really struggled to pack, say, a big camera or a processor with sufficient cooling or something like that into the smaller phones, and therefore the experience is just different and less good than a bigger phone. Because I think a bigger phone also gives you more opportunity for experimentation in terms of hardware, whilst also not blowing your R&D budget, because I could also see a small phone having a higher R&D budget for what it is, given the fact that it's more difficult to pack everything into a small form factor.
And on that point, the smaller phones tended to actually be thicker. And I imagine a company like Apple, who strive to always release the world's thinnest phones, they would not be happy with a really thick iPhone 15 mini or iPhone 16 mini. And I guess the aesthetics and that brand image is also going to be a pretty big part of the reason. Now back to Samsung, I think a potential other reason why they decided to axe the SE series was because that Samsung were actually struggling, especially after the S9 series and the whole thing with the Note 9. And it was really up to the S10 series to bring Samsung back. And the S10 series actually performed pretty well relative to the S9 series. So Samsung were on the trajectory of improving, but they were still struggling at this point. And I wonder if the S10e was just extra hassle for the company to focus on, when they instead needed to put all of their resources into actually becoming competitive again. Now, if you wanted a new phone, maybe your current phone is getting a bit old and the camera's maybe broken or cracked or something, you'd walk into a store, perhaps an EE or an O2 store, or even maybe a car phone warehouse, and you'd look at all the phones on display to try and pick your next phone. What phone are you going to gravitate to? The tiny 5.8-inch device in the corner, or this massive 6.7-inch right in front of you? And I think that is a very, very, very big reason why the sales for small phones isn't so high. But I just find this a really silly reason to not buy a small phone. So I'm almost struggling to see if it's actually true, because I'll go into a shop and be like, ooh, this small phone, it fits in my hand. I can reach the other side of the screen. I can put it in my pocket without feeling like I'm carrying a brick around. Right, Kuankuan?
Well, actually, that's entirely accurate. But I think that some people were like me and they just gravitate towards a bigger phone. And they think of the positives of a bigger phone, which are true and they exist. But it's maybe not as apparent what the negatives could be. I've obviously come to live with the negatives, but certainly I'll take into consideration next time I buy a phone that maybe I shouldn't go for the big phone, because it does take up a lot of space and it really hurts when it falls onto your face when you're using it in bed.
And we've seen that the market loves compact phones. I think that's a big reason as to why the Z Flip series is selling like hotcakes. People just love the fact that they can carry this really small device in their pocket. Another potential reason that these small phones weren't selling well is the battery life. Obviously, if you have a small phone, the first thing you're going to compromise is how big your battery is. And so if your battery just sucks, you're not going to buy a small phone again if you really, really, really wanted a large battery. But maybe, as we are now seeing this week, that silicon carbide batteries are being released by Chinese brands. Will those batteries then trickle over to manufacturers such as Samsung and Apple? And so will companies such as Samsung and Google be able to make good compact phones with good battery lives and therefore encourage a comeback for these small phones?
I just don't ever see small phones coming back. I think if you look at the trend in smartphone sizes, it's been getting bigger and bigger and bigger up until a point where it's essentially been plateauing. And for that to go back down, I just don't ever see that happening, really, personally. I think that it's just not going to be worth it for any manufacturer to make a small flagship phone.
Yeah, I'm just really confused at why these phones are not popular. I can kind of understand from a manufacturer's point of view why they might stop. Like, for example, 5G antennas are actually pretty big and they're quite hard to fit on a really small phone. But I don't see, maybe the perceived value of a small phone is worse? I don't know.
I think there's an element of truth in that. If you consider a wide variety of things like houses, like cars, things like that, people tend to prefer the bigger car, the bigger house, even if it's not entirely more practical. And I think the same is exactly true in mobile phones. And certainly this is very true in Asia, that people just want to buy the bigger phone. And there maybe isn't a logical reason to that, other than that it's either a status symbol or it makes them feel better knowing they have the biggest, the best of the bunch. And I think that's a key reason why small phones just don't sell as well, because you don't want to have the smaller than regular phone. Maybe you're fine with the regular phone, but you would really want the big phone. But you would never want the small phone, in my view.
Except us. I'd certainly want the small phone.
Yes, maybe me as well, given my experience with this big brick. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next Monday with a new episode.
And check out the description to sign up to our weekly newsletter. You can also reach out to us on X at the WaffleByte. See you there.